So just the
The safe mode.
yeah.
I think it's safe mode equals 0.
And that's going to be found in the SQL.
Just do the
Ah,
type in like MySQL safe mode equals 0.
What does this do?
Oh, alright, then.
It's set SQL underscore safe underscore updates equals 0.
We try.
If you want to turn it back, you just change it to 1.
yep, cool, thanks. Okay, so I'll run that, and then let's see if we got this update to work. Cool. Nice work, guys. So we'll just run a select all from notes again just to see that it changed. And we have our title and description changed to title and description. Okay, so now all of our SQL queries are working. So we should be able to go and attack our Ajax and Python. Cool. So we'll go over to Atom, and we're going to start off and go ahead and make a new view in our index.html. And what do we need in order to do Ajax? We need jQuery. So let's go get jQuery from Google. Google, jQuery. I'm just going to get it from the CDN because that's how I work. I could actually get 2.4 because it's a round, but 2.3 should work fine. Anybody know what the difference between versions 2 and versions 1 are? So version 2 is mobile friendly. Version 1 is backwards compatible with like early Explorer. Cool. Yeah, they have all the same functionality. The newest versions of 2s and 1s have pretty much the same functionalities, but as I said, 2 is mobile friendly. So I tend to use 2 because I don't really care about Explorer users. Sorry, Explorer users. Okay. Cool. So now we have our index.html and we have JavaScript running. And I'm just going to build the script on this page. And the first thing I do whenever I'm running JavaScript is I just write and make sure it's actually running. So I'll do something like document.ready, .ready, function, console log, hello. Because if this doesn't work, then nothing else that I try to do is going to be working. All right, so we can go to localhost 5000 and see if we get a hello. If we actually start our server. Cool. Now I'll just inspect element. And we have hello there. So looking like we should be working okay. That's really small, isn't it? I'll make that bigger. Okay. Great. All right. So what do we want to have on this page? So let's make a bunch of quick HTML on this page and see what we want, just to kind of give ourselves some sort of framework. We want some notes. Notes go here. All those notes are going to go into this div. Let's give this div an ID. Let's call that the notes ID. Let's do a couple of quick little styling on this little notes ID. Ah, that didn't work so well. And let's have our ID. Margin left, 25%. margin right, 25%. So it's going to center it. Minimum width, 49%. Minimum height, 80%. And let's give it a border. 1 pix solid black. Okay, we'll cruise over back to here. All right, so here's our nice little notes box. It's not dynamically resizable, so it's whatever your page looks like at the beginning. Oh, maybe it is. Sorry, I didn't think it was going to be. Cool. So basically all of our notes hopefully will fit inside this little nice box. Let's add another aspect to it. Let's do overflow Y. Scroll. So now if we fill it up, we can actually scroll on it. All right. So now we have our notes div. Let's make another div that's going to be how to create a new note. So let's have it as a form. This thing's going to have an action, which is going to be create note. It's going to have a method of being a post. And you can have a couple of input fields in it. What do we want? What sorts of input do we want in this thing? We want title. Yeah, so not very exciting stuff. So type is text. Value is nothing. Name equals title. And we'll make the second one a text area. And text areas are a little bit annoying in one sense, that if you don't if you put a space in between there, like if you put like that, it will fill your text area with empty space. So you either need to put them right next to each other, like so, or use comments to mitigate that. Anyways, just something fun about text areas. Name equals description. And then the last input type we need a submit. And in that submit, all we need to do is what? Yeah. Value equals add note. All right, let's give a quick look at that HTML, see what it looks like. All right, there's our comment. I wasn't expecting that. So let's get rid of that and just compress it. There we go. All right. So if we hit add note, it's going to break, right? So that's fine. It's what we expected. We'll have to organize this a little bit more in a bit, but for now it seems to be a functional thing. All right, so if we're going to have an action, then we need to have a route associated with that action. So let's just go over to our routes. And I'm just going to do all the stuff in the welcome controller because, well, we can. So let's cruise over to our routes. Get rid of all this junk. And create our first route. So what method did we use? All right, so method post. Its value was, I don't remember, so we're going to go back to HTML. Create note. And then we're going to go over to our welcome controller and do what? Welcome, create. So again, just like everything else that I do, I try to keep my naming consistent. So this would be a create method. So this is going to be an insert into notes where title and ID equal something. So let's go over to our controller now. So in our controller, we're going to have a create method. And let's just print, let's just return our request.form. So when we call this create method, hopefully what we'll get back on our HTML page is the request.form information. What's that? Oh man, please let me put in semicolons. What's that? It doesn't matter, but it's not very Python-y to use it. So, all right, so let's go ahead and see what happens when we do this and see if we can actually push something back to our page when we hit request.form to make sure that when we click our submit button that we're submitting something that we want to be an eventual note. Oops. I seem to have saved it somewhere in between. All right, so our crew's down here, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so immutable dictionary is not callable. Fine. But it's probably going to be close. So instead of returning it, let's just print it. And return, I posted something. Okay, database or server still up and running. All right, so blah, 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 blah. We'll call this one title for fun. All right, so I posted something works. So our create method's being called successfully. That's fantastic. Now, what we want to do is just make sure that we printed something in our console. And there's our description. There's description 1, and there's our title. They're different, suggesting that they probably are two different things. So I think we're good. I think we have something that we could actually call and send to our database now. All right. Cool. So let's load a model. And we're just going to stay with the welcome model. And we're not going to use get all users because get all users would be index. Because it's an index method if we're keeping things RESTful. But that's not the one we want to do anyways. We want to load this model up here. All right, so now we have a welcome model. Not going to do anything with it over here. And let's go and see what we do in our welcome model. So let's go over to our welcome model, take a look at it, delete a bunch of stuff that we don't want. All right, so what sorts of methods do we want in here? We want to create, self, and it's going to take parameters, and it's going to pass. We're going to have a def index, which is going to take self and pass. We're going to have def delete, self, pass, def update, self, params, pass. All right, so let's just talk about what these things are going to do really quickly. So create a new node. Index, get all notes from the database. Delete, remove note by ID from database. And update is going to do what? Update note from database. All right. So what do we need with the delete one based on our description? Yeah, so we need an ID. So params. Let's actually change these so that they make a little more sense. So we'll use ID here. Create. We need info. Update. We need a bunch of stuff. So we'll leave that as, we'll call that info too. Any other ones that we need? Nope, I think that's it. All right. So we know how to do all these different things because we already did them in our database, right? So let's go ahead and do the index, which is going to be query equals select star from notes. And I've got to remember how to do a query from the database. DB query. Yeah? Cool. All right. Let's see if that's still up and running. Cool. Let's call that method in our index method. So we'll go back over to our welcome controller. We're in our index method. Let's go ahead, self.models bracket welcome model .index. So we're going to call that. And what is it going to return? What's that? Yeah. So notes equals this thing. In our index, we want to have what? Just pay attention to just that part. Whoops. You guys can't. That didn't work so well. What if we want to pass something, just any old variable, and we just had these two things? How would we pass a variable? Notes equals notes, or something equals notes. In this case, I think it makes the most sense to just call it notes. So at this point, notes is an array of notes, hopefully. How would we confirm that? We would print this thing before we do that. How do we know this is not working? Because we actually didn't return anything from our index method in our controller, in our model. So let's fix that. All right, so let's give that a run and see what happens. Probably going to break, but maybe not. Okay, so that looks okay. It didn't break, which is pretty fantastic. Let's see what it prints out in our terminal. Oh, look, we have a note. And it's an array. And it has a dictionary inside of it. And it has other stuff. So it has an ID. It has created at with a date time. It has a title and a description and an updated at. Yes, we're off to the races. All right. So we have now successfully indexed a note. What's that? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. So we have all our notes. Pretty cool. What do we want to do with those notes on our index page? Yeah. So let's just show them on our index page. And we'll turn this into Ajax calls shortly here. But in our notes div, we're going to say something to the effect of for notes, or note in notes, and what sorts of things do we think we might want to get from this note? We want to get the title, we want to get the description, and we also want one other piece. What's that? Let's not worry about the created at. I mean, we can do stuff with created at. But the real critical piece is having the ID. Because we want to be able to update this thing. So if we don't have some way to access what we're updating, then we can't do anything with it. So the pieces that we want are the note bracket title, note bracket description, and note bracket ID. And this ID here is going to be passed in. I'm just going to write it in text. Hidden variable for form submission. So we know what to update or delete. Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. See if our page is actually getting notes the way we want it to. All right. My note is a note, hidden variable for form submission, so we know what to update. Looks good. All right. Not very stylish, not very Ajax-y, but getting closer. Let's just put a break in between each one of these just to make it a little bit cleaner, which we'll get rid of eventually. Take another quick look at it. Great. All right, so each node is going to have two things associated with it, right? One of those things is going to have a delete button, and the other thing is some way to update it. So rather than have them just echoed out, let's stick them into some sort of form. ID equals title, or class equals title. Action equals update. And what do we want to pass into that thing? Is that? Yeah. The note ID method equals post. Input class. We don't need this class equals anything. We'll say value equals title note. Thank you. And as always, please fix everything I'm doing. Type equals text, not text equals type. Name equals title. Similarly, we'll do a text field, our text area. And we're going to shove the description right in the middle of that thing. Name equals description. Let's close this form here. So notice that for this form, I don't actually have a submit button on it. Just something to note. We're going to deal with that shortly using Ajax. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what it's looking like now. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's kind of looking not super awesome, but at least it's kind of has some sort of personality. And I want to do an inspect element on it just to see if our form is actually carrying the ID like we want it to. So, oh, good. So I know you guys can't see that very well, so I'm going to just make it bigger. Whoa, too big, too big. But we can see it there. So it does actually have the update /2 like we want. So if we were to actually submit that form, and if we made a submit button, we could then have associated a route with it. So let's make that route. Routes. Again, it's a post type, I believe. It's going to have a method of update /. What do I do now? Yep. Equals welcome. What's that? Is that what you're asking? You're saying? Perfect. Cool. So we should have an update method, and it should require a parameter, or take a parameter, or have a parameter, and that parameter is going to be what the ID is. So let's go ahead and check that. So we're going to go ahead and make our welcome controller method. Def update self ID, print ID, return I will update something. Update. All right. So we have no way to submit this thing. So let's temporarily make a submit button. I'm going to copy the submit button. Update. And let's go ahead and run this thing and see what happens. So far, everybody good?
For the title, are you trying to find the title class value?
In this one here? No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just do that. Alan, do you need... Okay. While we're doing that, I'm just going to add another form here. But I'll be nice and slow about it. Since people are looking at this page anyways. Yeah. Double quotes. Okay. So the only reason it has to be in double quotes is because the title is in single quotes. All right, so while people were looking at this code and fixing it for me, I added another form, and this form has an action of delete, and again passes the note ID with the method post, and all it has in it is a submit button that says delete. Cool. So what do you think we're going to be doing with that? We're going to have a route for that thing. But before I move on to that route, questions about this? What is this going to look like when I load it? Crud is what it's going to look like. But it should have 2 forms, 2 buttons, kind of all stacked together. So let's give a quick look at that. Or it won't look like anything. All right, so here's form 1, here's form 2. The update button should do something because we made that route, whereas the delete button should break because we don't have that route intact yet. So I'll click delete first, see it break. But it does delete and go to delete/2, so that's good. Update should return some sort of text like, I will be a future update. And it does. All right. So with our update, what all did we pass over? So we wanted to make sure that we printed out the ID, and we do print out the ID for that one. Okay. Cool. All right, so we'll make a route for our delete method, and that's going to look pretty much the same as this one. It's now going to be delete ID cool. I think I set it as a post. We can set it as a get. Do you want me to set it as a get? I'll set it as a get just to... Yeah. Ideally it would be a delete. But we can't quite pull that off just yet. We can do it with Ajax, and I might set that up in a bit. And then let's go back over to our controller. So this is now going to a delete method. It's going to get an ID. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So def delete. Self ID colon print ID return quote I will delete something. So I'm feeling pretty good about all of our functions. So far they're doing what we're expecting them to do. So now we can start, I think, going to our actual database and doing stuff with them. All right, so update, similar to our create, had a request form. So I want to print that request form just to make sure that we can actually get stuff out of it. But otherwise, I think we can just do things like, for create, Do we have to return anything? Nah. No. All right. So why don't we do self.models, welcome model, dot create, and we're going to pass in request.form. So we're going to just pass in the entire request.form, which is going to have both a title and a description as key value pairs in that dictionary. So now if we go from our controller to our model, we want to create method in our model, which we have, and that request.form is now renamed info. So we should have something like info bracket title, info bracket description. And let's just clarify this thing. Let's call this thing note. So instead of info, we'll call it note title, note description. So those are the two pieces of information that should have come over in our request.params. And this might throw an error, again, because it might be this weird immutable dictionary object. So we may have to break it apart first and set a variable to it. But we'll find out shortly. But we know what we're going to do with that note title and that note description, right? What are we going to do? We're going to shove it into our wonderful query and use a string format. So we're going to say query equals, quote, insert into notes, whoops, into notes, title, description, created at, updated at, values of, quote, curly brackets, comma, quote, curly brackets, comma, now, dot, format, note, bracket, title, note, bracket, description. No semicolon. All right, so that should do our query, and then we'll do self.db dot query underscore db query. And hopefully that will insert stuff into our database. And we don't have to worry about returning anything from this one, because all we're doing is pushing stuff into our database. So we can just return a void. So just hitting return will send it back, but it won't actually have anything that gets sent back with it. But we can just say inserted, just for fun, in case we wanted to print something out. We're not going to be doing anything with this return, is the main point. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new note. Boo. Let's go ahead and create a new note. All right. So the title's over here. So let's call this thing Notey Note. And we will, it's another awesome note. And we'll add it. All right, so I posted something. Let's refresh our page and see if we have two notes now. Yay! All right, so we successfully added another note. Great. So create's working. And gets rid of some of this stuff. All right, we'll go back to our welcome controller and do update. So self.models, welcome model create, self.model, welcome color, create request.form. This is going to become update. And what all do we have to pass in this time? So we have to pass in the request.form, which is all the changes that we made. We also want to pass in the ID. So we can actually pass two things through, comma ID. So that's going to be the ID that's here, which is going to be there, which came from our route, which came from our form action. All right, so in our welcome model, our update method is going to take not just one parameter, but two parameters. So info, comma, ID. All right, its query is going to be equal to update notes set title equals, and let's make this thing note again from info. Note bracket, no, how about curly braces, comma, description equals curly braces, comma, updated at equals now, where ID equals curly brackets. And so the tuple that we're going to unpack is going to be format note bracket title, note bracket description, and ID. Does that look all right? All right. Again, we don't have to return our query, we just have to run it. And then return, we updated this. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that and see if we actually get things to update properly. I probably made some typos in here. So let's change my note to my note 3. Hit update. All right, maybe we actually successfully did it. Note 3. Yes. All right. So update's working. Okay. So now we just need to make a delete method. So when you return from your controller and it's just a string, it basically replaces the HTML of your page with that return statement. So we eventually won't be doing that. Yeah. I mean, we will, but we'll see what happens when we start running the ajax stuff. I'm going to write without ajax. This would be a redirect and then reload index. All right. Oh, sorry. So Kellen's question was, what does this return do? And if this was in the controller, it would replace the HTML. When we're returning it from the model, it's not really doing anything, it's just disappearing. So we're not setting a variable to it, we aren't passing it anywhere. I just put a quote of a string in there in case something went wrong. Yeah. That's a good question, and I'm not actually sure for Python, but let's try it. So with JavaScript, if you don't have a return in a lot of languages, it's just return is void. And so it's basically just the same thing as writing return blank. But I'm not sure if Python does that or not. So let's give it a shot. Yep, so it just returns void. So we don't actually need to have anything there, right? Because it successfully did it. So, but if we wanted to do some error catching, that'd be a good way to do it. So if something broke, we could use this to determine if the function ran. What's that? And that would show up in the terminal if we did something like this. So we're calling this update function from our controller, right? And so in our controller, we would have to say, exactly, so we'd say print that. And so that would run it, and it would also print it in our terminal, whatever got returned. So let's just do that one more time. So we'll just update. So we still updated, and then if we look at our terminal, here's where it shows up. And so if the function broke somewhere before that, that would never show up. And that's great. So we now have an update method. Delete's pretty straightforward. So we'll just do the exact same thing. Self model, welcome model, request form. We don't need to have a request form. We just need the ID. And we make this into a delete. Go to our model. Query. Equals delete from notes where ID equals curly braces dot format ID. Self DB query. Return. I should delete something. All right. If we look at our welcome controller, self models, so we're calling that delete function, so that should work. So let's try to delete a note. Goodbye, note 3 ASDF. Cool. All right, so now all of our functions are working. We have an index method. We've got all of our delete, update, create. Everything's going great, but we have 0 ajax going on. So let's make some ajax methods. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our index HTML and I'm going to make a partial view. It's going to be pretty simple. New folder, partials. Inside that partial, we're going to have a new file. It's going to be called index.html. And I'm going to just name it slightly differently. Notes underscore index.html. So that we know it's all the notes. Okay? In this thing, this is, because it's a partial, we don't need all the header information that we do in this main guy here. So all we actually need in there is whatever we're going to fill stuff up with. And in this case, it's just going to be this chunk here. So it just basically ripped out the guts of this form, which has going from all the notes in notes, printing out the notes into a form with a submit, and we're going to get rid of the submit value. And we're going to just leave the delete button sitting there.
So, did you cut that or pause it?
I cut it. Yep. All right, so now if we go ahead and look at our index page when we run it now, we're going to see that we're still able to create stuff. Or not. Oh, I didn't save it. I was like, wait, where have they gone? So now it's just an empty div again. So now we have to figure out some way to go ahead and get all those notes. All right, time for Ajax. All right, the first thing we want to do is we want to make a $.get method, and that get method is going to go to a route. And let's call this route index notes. What's it going to do? It's going to index the notes. Get all notes and populate that partial and return that partial and stick that info into the notes div. That's the goal of this particular Ajax call. So I'm going to just move that up here. And this is basically the index method for notes. All right, it's going to have a function associated with it. And that function is going to be what happens to the data after it gets returned. And initially, I'm just going to console log the data. And what that's going to be is it's going to be a bunch of HTML. Not super exciting. All right, so now we have this get method, and we have a route associated with it called index notes. So, or a path associated with it. So now we need a route to grab index notes. All right, so go back over to our routes folder. That's not the routes folder. So this is a get method. The route that we're getting is index notes. And we're going to go to the welcome folder. And we're not going to go to index. We're going to make another path, index notes. And what this is going to do, it's going to do something very simple. All right, it's going to basically do what index used to do, except we're going to make it into a partial view. So I'm going to put it right under index notes, or index, def index notes, self notes equals self notes. And what it's going to return, self.loadView partials slash index notes, or notes index. Notes equals notes equals notes. No! And semicolon. All right. I think that should be okay. All right. Sorry. Yes. Good call. And then notes equals notes. All right. So what is this method going to be doing? So basically all this method does is it returns a bunch of text, which is basically going to be this text. And that's all it's returning. So let's go ahead, run this function. Oh, never mind. Let's not run this function. Let's go back to our index.html page. Where? Thanks. Actually, that should run fine. All right. Let's do it. Ready? Aw. Alright, global name, notes is not defined. Let's go figure out where it's not defined at. Oops, let's go ahead and look at that error really quick. Right, notes, line 20, index. Welcome controller. Ah, right here. So when I stripped everything out, I forgot to strip that piece out. So I'm going to load this as a partial. Yep. Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and rerun that thing. All right, so now let's look at the console log because we should be running that get method. I'm going to make this smaller again. Oops. Actually, we'll just break it out into a second page. All right. And we'll just get console up here. And so this is what got printed out in our console. So is this form, action, update. Look, that just looks like just HTML, right? So we already know how to do stuff with JavaScript and add HTML to a JavaScript or to the DOM using jQuery. So let's use some of that knowledge and apply it right here and basically say whatever got stuck in here, we want to stick into our div. Holy moly. All right. So we go to our notes index HTML. Whoops, sorry, our main index HTML. And this is where that console log just came from. So that data is all the information, that whole text string. So what if we did, what do we need to do here? How would we get the notes? What's that? Yeah, so we want to append it to that div. So notes dot append data. Cool. So if we do that, basically everything inside that div will now be whatever that HTML was. So we basically made this like entire HTML chunk, and now we're moving it and being able to place it wherever we want. In fact, we could do it into two divs that are side by side. Or do it twice. Double notes. And this is kind of one of the advantages of doing stuff with jQuery and Ajax, is that you don't have that wasn't intentionally. This is going to be silly looking, so it doesn't really matter. But now we will be able to take that same data and put it two different places on the same page. So you could imagine somebody might have users and an index of users on one column. On another column, they would have all the books that people have read. And so those would be two different Ajax calls, basically the same way we're getting all the notes here. But instead of doing notes, they'd be users and books. All right, so let's go ahead and run that. All right, so there's Nodey Note 1. And then this is the second div that we created, Nodey Note down here. And it has a delete method. It has an update related to it. If we delete from here, it's going to delete both of them eventually. No more notes. So sad. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that because we only need one copy of these things. So I'm a little bit weird, and I like to have control of this particular object. And so I'm going to turn it into a function. So I'm going to move it out of the document ready. I'm going to say function index notes is basically equal to that thing. And so now, whenever I want, I can call that function. Remember, functions in JavaScript are first class, so it will automatically get moved to the top of all the JavaScript. So I can call it from anywhere. So I can say, well, let's just run it how it is. I'm going to add a note really quick.
It's not in the script tag.
It's still in the script tag. So it's still inside this tag here, which matches there. So I'm going to add a note, and I'm not going to call this method, and we'll see that our div is still empty. Blah, 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 blah. Refresh it. All right, so empty div. Let's call that method index notes. So now it fills up twice. I don't know why it filled up twice, but it did. Oh, probably because I refreshed the page. All right, so we actually have 2 notes in here. Let's delete one of them. Then we still just have the one. All right, so now we have a lot more control of this index notes. All right, let's do some more stuff. Let's play with our create method in this form here. So it's kind of annoying that every time I click create, my page doesn't update and refresh itself. Kind of pissed off about that. So, I know. So let's fix that. So we have this submit thing. Man, let's just fix it. All right. Let's give this thing an ID. Create. All right. So let's access our create form. So this should be that form. Let's just console log it and see what happens. Just to make sure that we have what we think we have. So refresh this guy. Look at the console, wherever it ran off to. So there it is. It's sitting there. It's a form. If it gets submitted, it's going to do stuff and create stuff for us. It's going to be awesome. But it's still not going to refresh, or it's still going to force us to refresh the page. Now, normally what we would do in our old way of doing things is we would do a redirect back to our first index and then let the page refresh and everything would get populated. But that's not the way of Ajax. Ajax lets us do things independently, as you guys have found out. So let's put some rules on our create form. All right, now we can just tell our create form not to refresh the page when it gets submitted. I think I kind of screwed that up. Now we can tell our form not to refresh when it gets submitted. So let's give that a shot and make sure our page doesn't refresh anymore. It's also not going to do anything else, but that's okay. That? It doesn't matter. But that's the same. Yeah. What's that?
What happened to that? Oh, that, remember the notes on the index?
So I called that index notes function, and then I had it do this stuff. So I just moved it into its own independent function. It'll become clear as to why I did that in just a second. All right, so let's make sure that when we create now, our page doesn't refresh. I'm going to do one other thing in here. I'm going to say console log, hello, I didn't refresh. Okay, we're going to create our form, add a note, check out our console. Oh, look, it didn't refresh. Awesome. I mean, I think. At least it's not being annoying and creating stuff and not letting me see it when I create stuff. All right. So now we aren't submitting the form, but we're also not getting information about it. So let's do some stuff with it. Let's do some ajax. Yes. Dot post. So because we're posting with this method, we want to use the ajax method of post. And what we want to do is get this dot attribute action, and I'm going to just console log that for us. So that's going to be the path that it's going. The data that's going to be get sent over as a post is going to be $ this dot serialize and then lastly it's going to run a function. Anybody know when this function gets run? What's that? So one option is when the action submit gets pushed, or the other option is when it returns. What do you guys think is the right answer, and why do you think ajax is important?
Say it again, one.
So one is right away. One is when things get back. So one vote for either one. What's that? 2 votes right away.
Is that what ajax is for?
Yeah, so that you don't have to go to multiple pages.
It's true you don't have to go to multiple pages, but why don't you have to go multiple pages? So what happened when you guys went to the Pokemon index? Did all those things load right away? When you went to the Pokemon page? Did all those things load instantaneously? No. And the reason they didn't is because each one was an ajax call, right? And so they loaded when the data came back to it. So basically this function is what's considered a promise. It's basically saying, I'm waiting here, I'm sitting. When something comes back to me, I'm going to do stuff. And that's what allows things in ajax to be asynchronous, because I can call this thing and then my page can keep going on and doing stuff, and then when I finally get information back, that particular chunk of the page will be loaded. So this function takes some data. And interestingly, I don't even want to do anything with the data. I don't want to do anything with this function really at all, except for basically take my index notes and run it again. And I'm going to change this from an HTML, an append to an HTML. So I'm basically going to overwrite that data every time by just calling this function. All right, it might break, but we'll see. So we're gonna get a console log of this attribute action and see what that is. Let's also console log this dot serialize. And let's, just for entertainment's sake, let's also console log $this. All right, so we'll give it a run, see what happens. Where have you gone? There you are. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. All right, so here are all our construct logs. So create note is $this action. This dot serialize is all this information. And this is this thingy. Serialize changes the information into information that can be passed over in a JSON decoded object, which is basically key equals value, then ampersand, key equals value. If we had more of these things, they could be and ampersand, key equals value. And basically when that gets passed over as data from a post, it gets shoved into that request.form, and then Python decodes that. All right, let's see what happened on our page when we did that. Ah, look, a new note. New note. New note. Add note. Oh, sweet. No page refresh. Our note is now added on here nicely. Awesome. All right. Our div is getting a little bit unruly, however. So I'm going to fix a little bit of our CSS. We did, but what I didn't do is I did a min height, but I didn't do a max height. So let's make this thing smaller. And then max height also 70%. Sweet. All right. So now we can scroll. Okay. So let's delete something. Ah, man, delete is being annoying now. So we basically have to take the same exact principle, do it for delete. So we can do this is going to be really interesting in a second. Delete dot submit. This is shockingly similar. All right, and we basically need to make our deletes have an ID. So delete here. Oh, bummer. It comes off of this page. That's okay. So we need to give these things an ID or a class or something, so we know what they are. So we can get access to them. So this is totally going to break, but that's okay. So I said, initially I said ID delete. We want to get every single different type of delete. We can use this still to get its attribute and its action and serialize it. But what happens when we do document.ready? When do all these functions fire? Yep, when the page loads initially. When does my delete get button get added?
It gets added when it's loaded. Does it only fire when you create it?
It does. Well, let's run it and see what happens. So in theory, this thing should be returning false, so our delete buttons shouldn't do anything, right? At this point, it should just console log these things. And I'll comment out this post for now. so we don't get any ajax event. All right, delete button. Oh man, it still did something. All right, so this is one critical aspect of Ajax and JavaScript in general. When you add something to the DOM, which is basically your page, any event handlers that you've added won't affect elements that are added after that event. So we basically added an event handler that said everything that has a .delete or a delete class that's on the page right now, we add this thing to it. Right? And we did that once. But then we added a whole bunch of delete buttons and they had the delete class, but they didn't have the same events associated with them. So we need to make sure that after we add them to the page, we then add those handlers to it. So we're actually going to take this thing. Does that make sense, by the way? Okay, so let me move it and see what happens. So we're going to say, add them to the page here. And I'm going to put this on top of that. So it's in the same function, but this delete method fires. So this is going to be an event handler. All class delete objects will have this behavior if they are present on the DOM. Okay, so how many delete, when we call it index notes, how many delete objects are there? Well, we don't actually add them until right here. So let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. All right, so we got a bunch of, and this is a delete class, but when we made that method, those weren't actually on the page yet. I know, weird, huh? So I'm just going to comment out this line, because that's the one that adds them. So now there's no notes. Okay, so I'll add that line back in. So this is going to be the add notes and buttons, etc. for that note. For that note. All right, so we'll just run it one more time. So we'll just to clarify that this is what adds all those things. That just short line of code there. And there it is. But again, this button doesn't have any methodology with it. So let's take this thing and move it under notes. So now all the buttons, so these are now on the page because we've called this method. Now these things will be able to affect those buttons. So let's give that a shot. All right, so there's some prints. So printed hello delete. There was no data associated with it. And form delete. Cool. All right, so we didn't actually delete anything with that call. So let's add the deleting method here. So it's still a post. This dot attribute action, this dot serialize, function data, and it calls the same function. So that will actually add or subtract stuff, hopefully, fingers crossed. So let's create a few more notes. Blah, 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 add note. Add note. All right. Ready? Delete. Oh, monkey.
Yeah, that's what I asked. Why didn't it show up as new data console log with new node and new node part of the data?
What's that?
Why didn't it show up in the console log earlier when you put it?
So we hadn't added those handlers to it yet. So that was, So we're just like we were talking about before. If we have this thing above, these things won't console log because these are part of this addition to this handler. All right, so we had some sort of thing fail there. Let's go ahead and just refresh our page real quick. I'm going to delete nodey note, our new note. Ah, there it is. I must not have just refreshed somehow. Nope. All right, let's see if we can delete it. Delete. All right. Okay, now the very last one, update. Same sort of principle. And all three of these things are type post. They go to the action, right? So create note does that. If we look at our partials, we have a post method here, and we have a post method there. Huh, this is kind of getting weird. All right, let's just make the update method. Guess how update's gonna work? Update's gonna do that. And it's going to do that when class update is submitted. Huh. Okay. So that's fine and dandy. But we don't have a submit button on update anymore. That's not so dandy. So let's think about exactly what we want update to do. What do we want update to do? We want update just to update, right? Do we actually need it to change the HTML at all? Nope.
If you want ajax, if you want it to do it, update it without changing the page.
Well, let's just play around with it just a little bit without actually implementing it. So let's go to our page. So what we want Ajax to do is basically, if we type something in here or type something in here, we want those changes to be effective in the database, right? But what we don't want, or we don't care if they update the page because we're already updating the page by typing. So we don't care if this comes back from the database because it's going to be the exact same thing we just typed in. So we don't actually have to change the HTML at all. We just need to do something when we type. All right. So let's mess around with the update function. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. I saw some head nod, so I'm going to say that's a yes, which I know it's totally not as an instructor, but hopefully with a little bit more explanation we can do it. So we want to say the class update form, and so we're going to, in our form, we're going to make this class equals update. And we're going to give it some unique attributes. Ready for the unique attribute? Okay. Totally tell you guys are. All right. We're not going to submit its form just yet. Dot key up. Well, on. So the dot on is another way to call different methods. And basically what I want to do is I want to call a method and have something happen when I type key, when a key comes up anytime in that form. So whether or not it's on either of the input fields. And I think I may have mistyped key up, so I'm just going to check it. It is predefined. What's that? Yep. It's not, but so it is just key up. So it's should work. And we're just at first we're going to do something. We're just going to console log just to make sure it's working. And so some people use key down. It turns out that key up is a bit more efficient. So it forces you to bring your hand up and prevent certain conflicts. And I'm not exactly sure what the conflicts are, but I know it works better because I've seen it work better. So, all right. Don't need to return anything false. On key up, function, run this function, make sure all those things are closed. I don't know what this thing is doing, just hanging out there. Probably breaking my code. Let's go ahead and see what's running. All right, type some stuff. All right, so key up got fired 6 times. So that looks like it's working. So every time we key up, we're going to have to submit this form. And I'm going to console log this to see what this actually is. So rather than console logging key up on every keystroke, we're going to console log this. Hopefully it's the form, but it may not be. But it is. So now we have access to the form again, and we already know how to submit stuff from the form. So we can see $post, this, serialize, function, data, index, notes, copy. But we don't actually have to index notes because we don't actually have to change anything. But let's just console log just for fun. And I'm going to say back from database. All right, so let's give this a shot. All right, so there's our, so we're going to type some things. Let's see if we get some back from databases. Awesome. Title. This is a grammatically correct note. Sort of. Sick. All right. So if that fired to our database correctly on every keystroke, if we refresh this page now, or if we add a note, this thing's not going to change and get updated. So we successfully changed the database on every keystroke. Yes. This is, yep. Yeah, so it queries a key value pair. So this is how, so Alan's question was, how do you do things like autofill? And so autofill basically queries the database every time you hit a keystroke, looks at what we've already typed, and then looks for a $ like in the database off of that keystroke, or off of what's in your form. Cool. All right, so that's notes. Questions?
I would ask a lot of questions.
How does this fit it? Where does this sort of fit into the arc of our learning? Is this sort of a primer for Rails slash reading, or is this kind of, will this be all this fit in Django? This feels like a little bit, definitely is a progression on top of what we've done on Pylot and Flask, but sort of how does that fit to the next steps?
Yeah, so a couple things. So it's a good reintroduction to using jQuery and playing with jQuery. So in that aspect, it's kind of a nice kind of break. But in terms of just general web development and things like mobile app development, so single page applications have much smoother loading because you don't have to load all of the pieces at once. You can be like, okay, I'm gonna load that piece, I'm gonna go load this smaller piece, I'm gonna load this other piece. And so some of them don't load all the time, but at least some of the page loads. And so you don't get this annoying like refresh lag. And so it's generally become the norm for well-developed web pages to run a single page application. And so it's a tool that can be used with Pylot or used with Django or used with Ruby or used with Mean to develop apps that are viable commercially. So I think that's probably where it fits in best. If you go to a page now and you see it refresh, you'll notice how annoying it is after time. So, plus it's really fun. So you can go and get APIs, load them as partials into your divs. You can load, your own custom information into another part of your div. And it just gives your web pages a much more dynamic feel. Yeah.
Realistically, you literally are accessing database.
Yeah. So, yep. So the way I generally deal with it is I don't update the database until I either do a couple things. Either mouse out of the form, and I'll do one update right then and submit everything. And then I'll also do a second update when you leave the page. So if you close the page, then I'll do the update then. And so, so that way anything that's on the page will be updated, and it will do effectively the same thing. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Is there any bit of the assignment that you didn't cover here? I found it's really hard to sort of wrap up the rest of it. Like, it's really useful to have this as like a kind of a template for how to understand what the heck is going on and a lot of stuff that we do in the future or past. Is there anything to complete this assignment?
I think this is the whole thing, right? So the only thing that we didn't really touch on would be a show method. And we can do that really quickly. But basically a show method would be basically replacing this HTML with just information about that specific node. So yeah, we'll do it real quick, if that's okay. Yeah. So RESTful routes, there's this index method, there's this create method, there's a show method, which we haven't touched, and there's a delete method. And those are the kind of the four methods that touch the database. So we're just going to make a show button really quick and do that fourth method that touches the database really quick. We touched on it in terms of our SQL queries already. But let's just build it out. All right, so show is going to work very similar to delete in the terms of what we have getting passed through. So all we need for show is the note ID. So we're going to create that. And I'm going to name this show, even though that's not the nice RESTful routing name of it. It's going to have a post and a value show. All right, so now we have a new button, a new action. And we need a route for that, right? going to be the same as the delete route, except it's going to be called show. Show. In our controller, def show, self ID, self dot models, welcome model show, and show is actually going to be just like index went and got something from the database. Show is also going to go and get something from the database, and what it's going to get is a single note. So note equals self ID, or note equals self.models welcome model show, and then rather than just returning I posted something, or I will update something, or I will delete something, let's return a partial view. Self.loadView, partials, notes, show.html, and it's going to take a note, equals note, cool. We're going to make a new partial, and it's going to be notes show. And in that partial, let's just make this thing annoying. H1 note bracket title description created at. So normally the show method shows you a little bit more information than just the index would have. And unfortunately, we just don't have that much more information. So I'm just going to show created at and updated at as well. All right. And we're going to make it nice, big, and annoying. So now let's go back over to our index page. And we're going to have a listener for our show method. And I think I kind of messed up our show method slightly. So let me look back at our notes underscore index. Okay, it is class show. I thought I had left that as class delete. Sorry about that. So when we submit something from the show, we're going to run a function. That function, for now, is just going to console log hello. Shortly, it's going to basically do the exact same thing here, except it's not going to do data index notes. It'll do something else. Well, actually, let's just do this stuff and console log data. All right. So how are things looking so far? So we have, what all did I just screw up there? Let's go through and go through it slowly. There's a bunch of stuff. So let's look at our controller. So we have our show method. We go to our note equals self.models welcome.model.show.id. So we should be able to go to our model and find that method, right? Create, index, delete, update. No show. All right, so we need a show. Def show, self, ID, right? Because we passed in the ID. The query. How are we going to get one from the database? Oh, yes. Thank you. Colon. Okay. So back to our query. Equals. Yep. Yeah. All right. And again, we need to return something this time because we actually need to get that information back. So we're going to say return self-db query query. All right. So that's one thing we messed up. So we didn't have a model in our method being called from our controller. Let's go back to our controller really quick. What else did we mess up here? So we have this thing coming back. What is note when it comes back in terms of data type? Is it just a dictionary or is it something else? Yep. It's a list. How long is that list? Well, in this case, we selected by ID, so we should only be a unique ID, right? Yeah. So as Emmett said and Alan said, it's length of 1. So when we have this note equals note, we don't necessarily want this entire list, right? We just want the 0th index of it. All right, so now we can return this load view. So again, just like we started off with our index method, if we console log this thing, it's just going to be HTML of H1 for H1 tags. Yeah.
Line 31, is that correct?
Yep. I think. Line 31.
Well, you can print one of them.
Yeah, I mean it doesn't. Print's just going to show up in our terminal. It's not hurting anything. It doesn't have to be a print there. We were just doing that for a return statement earlier. Mainly, we just wanted to make sure that we ran this thing. All right. So we're going to get back that partial HTML. Shall we go look at it? Oh man, what did I screw up? All right, so we don't have any notes yet. Syntax error after argument list. Index 53. Index 53. Show, submit. We need. Cool. Yeah, these ones will be auto generated, so they're okay. But all right, so there's a bunch of notes. We can show one of them, and at this point we aren't doing anything with the show, so we basically just have it returning this giant thing. We didn't return false. We didn't do a whole bunch of other things, so it's actually just doing that and returning this whole thing. So we want to do a return false here. That'll keep it from reloading the page. Show again. And now we see all that information show up in our console here, and we can then push it to wherever we want it to go. So let's make some place to put it. Well, let's just stick it on here somewhere. Let's just take a div ID equals show or single note. And then we're just going to shove the data into that thing. And how do we shove the data in? We can just do get it from jQuery, single note, .html, data. Cool. All right, so load our page, show this one. Hey, there it is. Okay, let's show a different one. There's that one. All right, and those are basically all the CRUD routes. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
The function index of nodes.
Yep.
Did you just declare it there? That's the first place you declared it?
Yeah. And then I just called it a couple times.
And what's the index underscore nodes with the semicolon up there?
This is me calling and firing this function the very first time. So when you load the page, I want that thing to fire, because that's going to go and get all the notes that I currently have.
Is that under document right?
Yep. Yeah, so document already ends right here.
You're sharing this on your
Yeah.
And you declared the index underscore nodes just so that you have more control over
Yeah, so I can basically call it like this, because otherwise I'd repeat the code a bunch of times.
There'll be a lot of jQuery.
Yeah. More questions? All right, well, I'll push this up to jQuery real quick.
Mike, if we can't go back to that update function on the controller.
Update on my controller. Yep.
Printing forms on 30 and 31, then nothing isn't really talking to the model. So
Yeah, it still talks. So this still calls the function. So
it still calls a function and
Yeah.
it prints it.
yeah, it prints the result of that function.
And it calls it.
Yep.
I have one more question.
Yep.
When does return print stuff on the terminal?
Return won't print it unless we tell it to print. Yep. So yeah, so let me clarify what's going on here. Split right. And we're going to look at the welcome controller, or the welcome model. And then, all right, so these are the two lines that we're talking about. So what I wanted to do was, if something broke, I wanted to see this thing print out, or not see this thing print out. And so by calling print, I'm printing this thing's return, whatever it is. So I'm calling this method, this function, and that function returns this, which then gets printed out.
Okay. I see. What confused me was that the naming of the controller. They told us to name it as plurals, right? Welcomes.
Right.
Okay, so I see.
Yeah, I just used what they had in there because I was too lazy to change
That's
it.
very
So what happens on line 30 if you separate print and request.form?
So request.form by itself just doesn't do anything. It may actually break,
Yeah, basically.
because request.form is,
Set something to equal request.form is all right.
I could, but we don't need to. I just printed it out to see what came from our form. So that we,
You already just tested, you just tested.
yeah, just to make sure that we got information from our form. So basically all my prints are basically
So
testing
line-
events.
So line 31 you'd need to have in order for it to run with the dot update, right?
No, we can get rid of the print,
Okay.
because all the print is doing is printing this thing, and we don't really care about that thing right now. So
It was just a double test.
yeah, because Kellen asked why we would return something, and Colin pointed out that if you leave return blank, it'll return nothing, but it will still return. So we were testing whether or not it functioned or not.
And normally you return false.
Yeah, this was just a testing event. So it was basically a string that does exactly that. It's if something broke, we could see if this thing got printed ever or not. Cool. Yeah. Awesome. All right, I'm going to stop this.